Let's talk about Jane Eyre. It's a very strange novel, and I think you've pointed this out yourself, John, isn't it? Very
Yes.
strange.
I think people think of the strangeness of Jane Eyre, not wrongly, but almost exclusively in terms of sort of what happens in it. It's after all a novel which towards the end turns apparently on an instance of sort of supernatural telepathy.
Yes.
You know, Jane, who is being besieged by St. John Rivers, who wants her to go to India with him and sort of die converting pagans to Christianity. And we are to understand that's a tempting prospect for Jane. She doesn't find that a terrible, well, she finds it terrible, but also she thinks maybe she should do that. And she's rescued from this by hearing Rochester's voice. And when she is reunited with him, he tells her that he did indeed cry across the hundreds of miles, however far it is, that separated them. It's famously, you know, there are all sorts of apparent sort of hauntings and dreams and phantasms. Her much earlier, right near the beginning of the novel, her imprisonment in the Red Room, which has exercised kind of generations of psychoanalytic critics very happily. In the language that not just Jane Eyre's narrator uses, but that Jane and Mr. Rochester use with each other, there's endless references to sort of goblins and elves and fairies. There's this peculiar, really peculiar thing where Rochester dresses up as a gypsy woman and predicts both Jane's fortune and Blanche Ingram's fortune, rather contrasting fortunes. So the novel seems to dabble in the supernatural rather, and it's often said that's a sort of gothic element in it. I think one shouldn't miss the fact, however, that it's also strange because of the voice of the narrator. And we all know about her plainness, her frankness, her immediacy, but she's got a very weird style of writing, which is partly sort of based on, you know, the King James Bible, and partly it's a style of Charlotte Bronte's own. I mean, it's just amazing. You know, critics have sort of pointed this out rather pedantically for years, but, you know, an awful lot of her sentences are inverted. So
it's beginning with me. And
the sort of object of the sentence comes first, and then the verb at the end. She does, you know, well did I know. She will, I mean, that sort of thing. It's a very simple example. Long did I suffer. These are the sort of, this is the sort of cadence of Jane Austen's writing. This is the cadence of Jane Eyre's narration. And even if you don't consciously notice it, it gets under your skin. And it's a very sort of peculiar voice, I think.
Of course, she is a very peculiar heroine, very unconventional heroine.
Yes.
She's not pretty like
Yes.
the heroines of Jane Austen. And nor is he a conventional hero in any way. In that sense, too, it's unconventional.
Yes, I mean, Jane Eyre insists on the physical unattractiveness of the two protagonists. Plain Jane, of course, famously. But also, actually, Mr. Rochester. I mean, there's an extraordinary episode where Jane goes back to see Aunt Reed, who's dying, and the two cousins, one who's this sort of plump, voluptuous airhead, and one who's, I mean, he's a very sort of stereotype, really, characters, and one who's this pinched, sour, sort of Calvinistic, prematurely aged woman. And she can't really talk to either of them, so she does drawings, and she does a drawing, which is a drawing from her memory of Mr. Rochester. And one of her cousins sees it and says, "Ugh, who's that horrible, ugly man?" And she says, "Oh, a character from my fancy." You know, he is not, in a conventional way, sort of the Byronic hero he's sometimes said to be. He too is somehow smitten by nature and physically unattractive, and that's very, you know, it's very important to the kind of passion that there is between them and to the nature of this narrative. This is not an ordinary love story.
And you talked about the psychoanalytic critics having
Yes.
fun. I mean, they've also had a lot of enjoyment in discussing the Bertha
Yes.
Jane Eyre
Yes.
relationship, Bertha being the mad wife, and just what she represents. I mean, is she indeed a part of Jane?
Yes. Well, I mean, this is, I would, I would like to sort of issue a cri de coeur about Bertha, actually, because the mad woman in the attic, and as a old former friend and colleague who's sadly dead now, Michael Mason, who once edited Jane Eyre, said, it's not an attic, she's not in the attic, she's actually quite commodious third floor apartment with attics above. But anyway, it's become, because of a very powerful, brilliantly argued and influential book, The Mad Woman in the Attic, by two American critics, it's become sort of orthodoxy that Bertha is, as it were, Jane Eyre's unconscious and sort of wreaks the havoc that Jane can't. Now,
And the passion that she can't express.
Absolutely, and that was their argument. That is a very interesting, but I mean, it's an interpretation. To my mind, that's not how I see it. Jane does express herself. The book is her expression of herself, the narrative. It's true that she doesn't necessarily express herself always to other characters in the book, although she does sometimes. I mean, she's extraordinarily outspoken, truculent, passionate. I mean, she's scarcely kind of a hemmed-in person in her dialogue, but also she has this extraordinary intimacy with the reader. Famously, the novel, many, many times the narrative will say, reader, and then tell us something, and sometimes it's something she will tell nobody else. Now, it doesn't seem to me that Jane Eyre is a peculiarly repressed narrator or a peculiarly repressed character, but I think it's very important that it doesn't become sort of somehow taken for granted that Charlotte Bronte wanted us to think that, and sort of generations of A-level candidates seem to have become persuaded of it, but it's an interpretation rather than a fact, I think.
Yeah. Why do you think, given all that, why does Jane leave Rochester when she discovers about Bertha being his wife? I mean, they both love each other.
Yes.
She acknowledges that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Jane leaves Thornfield for two reasons, really. I mean, the first is implicit, which is that Rochester has deceived her, and that deception that deception means that their relationship, however real their love may be, can't be sustained. But she also leaves because he says to her, oh, okay, I'm married, so you can be my mistress. And we know this man has had mistresses. He's not like a Jane Austen hero. Yeah. Jane Austen hero has somehow not had sex before, and we may think, it's sometimes said about Mr. Knightley, well, he's 37, he's never had a girlfriend. But only rakes in Jane Austen have had sexual relationships before marriage. But we're left in no doubt that Mr. Rochester, in France, of course, that's safe. Of course. In France, they're all over there in France. And he's carried on with actresses and all sorts. So he's sexually experienced, and he says to Jane, you can be my mistress. And they can't, as it were, live together just like master and servant as they have done before. Now that their love is acknowledged, he says, well, we can do this, you can be my mistress. And she absolutely has to reject that. And, funnily enough, given Charlotte Bronte's accusation that Jane Austen was passionless, there's a lot more actual sex that actually goes on in Pride and Prejudice than in in any Charlotte Bronte novel. And Jane Eyre is, she's a good woman, she's a Christian. I mean, it's a very, very Christian novel. And she cannot accept that. And of course she can't accept it because also, you know, in one of her most magnificent outbursts, when she doesn't know that he's going to propose marriage to her, she says that she's fully his equal. She may be a servant, she may be small and plain and poor, but she's fully his equal, and her soul is worth as much as his. And if she was beautiful and rich, she'd make him suffer like he makes her suffer. Yeah. And it's fantastic. And that's all, I think, very much underwritten by the heroine's Christianity. You know, she matters as much before God as he does. And because of that, of course she can't be his mistress. You know, that would be, in a way, a position of sort of subservience, as well as being against her morals. So she has to go.
And in the end, she wins him, as it were, but it's only after the terrible fire and after he loses the sight of an eye and is badly burnt. Why does Bronte end the novel like that?
Yeah. I mean, I think there have been lots of criticisms of the ending of Jane Eyre, and however much you admire and love it, it's the ending which is most troubling. First of all, Charlotte Bronte has to get rid of Bertha. Yeah. She has to get rid of Bertha, and she has to make Rochester as not responsible as possible. So, okay, she can't just make her die. That would just look too convenient. Bertha is, after all, characterised by her physical strength. So you can see the fire, the madness. Bertha sort of immolates herself. And Rochester, of course, has to try to save her. Yes? As if he's trying to... You know, he must not be responsible for the happy ending. So he tries to save her. So the injury is good for that. The blindness is good for that. And also, this is a novel about power. And that's one of the brilliant things about it, that the power relationship, master and servant, who has power over who, is something that Charlotte Bronte is not afraid of. She's really interested in it. And in a way that people find quite disturbing, that, you know, Jane is at once a rebel, and yet she's somebody who believes Rochester is her master. Yeah. And so you can see, to bring about the ending logically, she must reverse the power relationship at the end. So he needs her. And she's obviously very, very sort of both touched and turned on as a novelist by this thing of kind of who's there, you know. I mean, it's been replicated in a small number of sort of Hollywood films and things, you know, that sort of the blindness thing, the blind man who the touch of the woman, who is it? She liked that slightly kind of, is it sentimental? I don't know, but that affecting ending. I would say the problem with the ending is that we can just about accept that. It's when he has an operation which miraculously restores his sight, but I think we begin to think, oh dear.